I found out about this story when I was out for breakfast one day with Charlie Rizzo. He's telling me about his father, Matt, and he always thought his father had been blinded in a hunting accident. But as it turns out, his father had been in the mob and was blinded in a robbery in Chicago in the 1930s and had been sent to Stateville Prison. I think what struck me the most about the story was here was this kid, he's 22 years old when he goes into prison. He's newly blind. He's in an 8 by 12 foot cell. He's in probably the darkest place that anyone could be, and yet he manages to find some light in all of that darkness. And what's even more remarkable to me is that the light is coming from Nathan Leopold, who taught himself to read Braille so he could teach Matt Rizzo how to read. And then he turned him on to all this great literature that would eventually save his life. After I acquired the life rights in 2010, I set out to do the project as a transmedia rollout. So I had a playwright that was working on a stage play, and I had written several screenplays, and so I wrote a screenplay based on what I thought would be the movie, and I thought, well, maybe I can do it as a graphic novel, and the graphic novel can be sort of the storyboard for the movie. But once we got into it, it became clear that the graphic novel had a life of its own and had something that it wanted to say in the form of a graphic novel. When we started the project, Landis had never done a graphic novel, and I'd never even read one. So it was a learning process for both of us. We didn't really know what we were doing. You know, in a movie, it's the editor that controls the pacing, but one of the really great things I discovered in this process of working with Landis was that the reader in a graphic novel controls the pacing. And this allowed us to not only layer the story horizontally, but we could also layer it vertically. Landis's pen and ink work was so dense and so intense that it was really fun to think through how we could put more content, more of the story onto the page, and do it in such a way that people could either take the time to read these asides or keep going, follow the plot, keep moving, keep turning the pages, and then maybe come back later to reread it and get a bigger picture, a fuller understanding of all that was going on in this story. I was very curious about the literature that Matt Rizzo had been exposed to in prison, and I had never read the Divine Comedy before I started this project. I knew about Dante and the Inferno. I'd skimmed the Inferno in the early 2000s when we were doing some street theater work, but it was looking through the images of Dante's Inferno and then realizing that the prison, F House, where Matt Rizzo was incarcerated with Nathan Leopold, was built in a panopticon design. And so it began to make sense to me that the way we could see the world of our protagonist in the story, Matt Rizzo, was to go into his imagination and see what he sees, and the circles of hell that were present in the Inferno had a real distinct parallel to the circles of hell that were lining each floor of the Panopticon prison at Stateville. This story found me at a stage in my life where I needed to hear the voice of the poet, pay attention to it. Matt Rizzo was writing about this idea of the secret language of the poet, that all of these great poets of Western civilization have been writing about this common human journey that we all share. It begins when we arrive here on the planet and it ends when we leave. And for me, the question is, how am I going to spend my time in between the bookends, right? Like, what kind of life can I live given my limitations? Now, Matt Rizzo was able to use his imagination to rise above the circumstances. And this is really relevant today. You know, the truth of imagination, as the poet John Keats called it, is just as real as any fact. And here we are, we're in a pandemic, we're locked down, quarantined, enclosed. We have this forced isolation that is happening. And I don't know that it's exactly an escape, but we certainly need to rise above our current circumstances, which I think is really one of the highest callings that we can do, is to use our imagination to bring beauty into the world, to make the journey that we're on be worthy of our time and our investment of our skills and our gifts. And I think one of the amazing things about this is that it's a bit like the Philosopher's Stone. What we're doing is we're turning energy into matter, right? Like, I had an idea to make a graphic novel, and it's a dream, and it's a thought, and it's energy. And then through perseverance, through work, through Landis's detailed, intense devotion to pen and ink, it becomes matter. So I think that the imagination allows us to transform our lives in ways that benefit not only ourselves, but benefit others, benefit the planet. We're suffering right now in this country, in the United States, from a kind of anti-intellectualism. And I think that it's going to take imagination and truth to rise above the situation, to break through, and to live with integrity the life that we have here on Earth.
I didn't know David Carlson until he and I started working together on The Hunting Accident. When we started working on this project, I had never done anything to this extent collaboratively before with anybody, and so it was definitely a learning process, but it was an extremely rewarding process just creatively, aside from the story itself. Learning to both trust and compromise with another creator. Dave and I would have such long conversations about what to do with the story, and I would sometimes suggest things to change in the story. He would sometimes suggest things for me to change with the drawings, and so much of that happened that neither David nor I can fully remember who suggested what, and the story became its own project. The short and honest answer about why the drawings are in black and white is that I'm not very good with color, and I couldn't have even imagined of how to tackle something of this scale in color. But the work of mine that David had seen when he chose to hire me was all in black and white, and so I had that working to my advantage, and that I think David actually wanted something black and white, given that he liked what I was doing in my other projects. But from a more conceptual level with the story, I have a hard time imagining how this book could have been done in color, in that given that it's about a blind man and this, both actual and figurative darkness that he goes through with his life and in prison, that it, in my mind, the coldness of the black and white lines only adds to the depth or the reality of that new world he's experiencing and exploring within the prison, being a newly blinded man. I'm not sure if in the French edition or not, but in the English edition, the last two-page spread in the book is actually in color. And we decided to do that in the last scene because it's culminating essentially in the death of Matt Rizzo, or him becoming who he is as one of these great poets, or joining off into the tradition of those poets. And so that last closing color spread is essentially Matt Rizzo crossing the threshold into the full reality of his imagination. And to see those 2 pages in color after having 450 pages of black and white is it still surprises me whenever I flip through the book. So, well, the process to create this book ended up being much longer than David and I had anticipated. When he had initially hired me, he said this was going to be a 6-month project, and it turned into a 3-year project. And that broke down roughly in that the first 2 months or so, I just spent doing thumbnails of the entire book. And then after that, David and I spent another 2 to 3 months intensely working every day, fleshing out that storyboard. We blew up all the thumbnails and put them around our studio, and we'd spend every day just walking through the story, making changes, adjusting where certain themes should pop up and where things needed to be added. And while those 2 to 3 months ended up adding a lot to the book grew in girth considerably during those two to 3 months. But that's also where I think the story really came alive, because that was when David's idea of the story and my idea of the story merged into one collective idea that became what the book was to be. And then after those 2 to 3 intensive months, it was about another 2.5 years of me doing the final pencil drawings and doing the inking on top of it. However, it wasn't just me working in the studio those 2.5 years. That time was filled up with David and I having these intense conversations about the story, where we kept revising things, and we'd go off on tangents on things that we didn't necessarily think would end up in the book, or that's not why we were talking about it, but it would somehow end up changing the book. And so the longer David and I worked on this together, the more alive the book became to both of us, but just as kind of a separate entity. What David and I often say is that the story started telling itself. And I think the reason that happened was because David and I gave the story room to breathe. David and I are now extremely close friends, and I'm incredibly grateful to him for bringing me on to this project and taking me along on the adventure of what this has become.